Hello, welcome to another presentation about Kogito. This time I'll be talking about the Management Console, a new service that we recently introduced. So to demonstrate how you can use the Management Console, I'll showcase a typical architecture when you're doing a project with Kogito. In this case, I'm using the travel agency as an example, and within the processes of this travel agency, you can see two different microservices, the Kogito Visas and the Kogito Travel Agency. So they're two independent services, each one dealing with a separate part of the business, and they do communicate with each other through sending Kafka messages, right? So apart from that, they also communicate with an external service where the runtime execution of this process is easily available and easily searchable, which is the data index. And all of this, it's also persisted into an infinite span database, right? So you can imagine this is just an example, but Kogito Visas or Kogito Travel Agency, depending on your use case, could be scaled to a number of different runtimes, and that can become quite tricky to manage all the process that are running inside these microservices. That's where the Management Console comes in. So the Management Console itself does not store any data. So what it does is it looks into the data index service to see the actual data that's being pushed from these services via Kafka and stored into infinite span. So all the data that's shown on the Management Console, it actually comes from the data index service. So based on the data that's there, the Management Console can give you an overview about the current state of the execution of the processes. And not only that, it also allows you to react or trigger the execution of a different node in the process, or trigger a retry of a specific node. So it allows you to take actions based on the state of the process. Even, for instance, if you need to cancel or what we call abort the execution of the process. So that is done through REST endpoints on the specific runtime. So the information that stores into the data index provides the Management Console the exact information about where the endpoint for each of these microservices lives. So then the Management Console can actually trigger those endpoints for executing these management operations. So talking a little bit more in depth about the Management Console itself, of what it consists. So the Management Console, it's a Quarkus application based on Quarkus and Vertex. So it's currently using one of the latest versions, I believe it's 1.3. It also has a front end based on React and heavily uses GraphQL as the main backbone to interact with the data index, right? So all of the data that comes from the data index, it's actually being fetched via GraphQL, and that's a powerful combination that we have there between React and GraphQL. So what sort of operations or features do we have on the Management Console? So to start with, you need to be able to see the actual processes that has been executed or are within the execution at the current moment. So that's shown in the form of a list when you get to the Management Console. So it allows you to see the active process, the process that are in error, the process that have been completed. So all of that based on the data that's being pushed and received by the data index. One important point that it helps to the management console helps to visualize also this process in the way that they correlate with each other. So that's important because, for instance, in the demo that I'm gonna show later in this video, you'll see that, for instance, the booking process, the travel agency process, the main one, it's actually supported by two other reusable processes to do the booking of the hotel and the flight. So from the UI, we can actually see the correlation of those processes, or how those sub-processes help the parent process to complete its goal. As I mentioned, so searching by status, searching by business key as well. If your process define an attribute or some form of business relevant string as the business key, the management console is also able to not only display that information, but also allows you to find that, and I can show also an example of that later in the demo. So the book operations is just a helpful way for you to execute what we call the management operations, the ones that I mentioned, into the REST endpoints, but then triggering those into multiple instances. So let's say you have a system failure. One of the backbone systems was down, and a lot of the process got stuck into certain integration point because an external system wasn't responding. So you can actually go in there and select all of the process that you know that depend on that system. They're probably now sitting there in error state, and then let's say call a retry operation. So the retry operation will make the engine, the Kogito engine, actually try to re-execute the node that failed the execution. And then apart from that, apart from the list itself, we have the details of the process. On the details page, we can see a bit of an overview of the process, some of its details, the time that was started, if it was completed, the actual state it has. It also easily allows you to navigate between the parent and the child processes, right? And also gives you a timeline view of the execution of the nodes in the process. So you can see a timeline there showing, the current nodes, the ones that were completed, the ones that are active, and if you have any specific node that it's failing at the moment, you can go and perform actions on those nodes. Apart from that, on the details page, you can actually also see the variables of the process, the current state of the variables of that process. Right. So jumping to the next part, we have the domain explorer, and this is a very exciting feature because this actually allows you to see the data, the business data, or what we call the domain data, from a different perspective. And that perspective does not has any technical specifics about the process itself. So if we're talking about travels in this domain, this particular domain for this example, we can go on that UI and see a list of travels, a list of visa applications. We can see the name of the traveler, the destinations. So that it's a powerful way for you to see what's going on in terms of the business data that's traveling through the processes. And not only that, it helps you find the processes based on that. So let's say that you have an issue with travelers that are going to a specific country. So you can actually go there and see those processes and easily find. The filtering is something that's coming up into the next next release, but you already can see the travels all the drivers listed there. So that's really powerful. It allows you to combine that with the processes. So as soon as you find the domain specific data that you are searching for, it shows you the processes that are related to that specific domain. Then you can do the same operations that I just mentioned before. You can actually go in there, check the process status, check the parent, the child processes, and act on those. So in regards to this service, so the Management Console generates a runner jar as a Quarkus application, and for that you can run into a different from different methods, basically. So you can download or check out our GitHub repository. You can build it locally and run the runner jar that's generated, or you can download our latest snapshot. That's the comment I have here. That's the example I'm gonna show, which just runs locally the Management Console. So the Management Console by default runs on port 8080. We just changed that to 8280, so just you don't conflict with any other service that you're running locally. But that's really a configuration that you can adjust. The only dependency that you have here is the Kogito data index URL, which by default points to the default port of the data index, right? So, but if you're running the data index on its default configuration, the Management Console will be already connecting to that. So no other dependencies that you need to set up to actually get the Management Console running. There are other ways to run the Management Console. We also provide an image for running the Management Console that you can pull, or you can also use the operator on OpenShift to provision the Management Console for you. So there's a couple of ways that you can get the Management Console running. So getting the Management Console running is fairly simple. The other thing that we need to take into consideration is what's needed from the other services in this architecture, right? So one thing that's important, we need to have a runtime that has support to events. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the Management Console relies on the data that comes from the data index. So the data index itself needs to receive the information about the processes that are running on the different runtimes. And that's done through inventing, and now we currently support Kafka. So if we're running a runtime, it needs the support, the add-on for messaging. You need a data index running, and you need the management add-on as well. So the management add-on is something important if you want to have all the capabilities of the Management Console. You don't necessarily need that one, but I will show in the demo that this add-on is actually necessary if you want to execute the management operations on the runtime. So if you want to abort, skip, or retry a specific process, that's when you need to have the management add-on added to the runtime. If you don't do that, if you don't add this add-on, that's fine. The only thing is that the Management Console becomes more of a read-only view of the data. So you can actually see and interact with the processes, but you can't really execute any operations such as the ones I mentioned here, and we'll be expanding those operations in the near future, right? Another thing that's really important, if you have the management add-on and you want to execute the abort, skip, and retry operations, you also need to set the Kogito service URL parameter into your Kogito runtime. So that is important because that's how the management console can actually go and execute or build the URL that needs for executing the REST operation. So remember when I mentioned into the beginning that the management console uses the data that comes from the data index, but it also executes these management operations on top of the runtimes. And for doing that, it actually needs to build the URL for connecting with the services. So that's important that you set that on the Kogito runtime to expose the public URL of the service. So it can call the REST operations. And of course, you need to run the management console itself. Okay, so now let's go to a quick demo. What I want to show first here is the main process of the Kogito travel agency. This is a fairly straightforward process. The most important thing here that I want to highlight is that this process actually does have two other sub-processes, the book hotel and the book flight. So as we go through these steps in the process, we actually execute two other processes that help build or help in the goal of executing this whole booking, right? So let me jump into my demo here. Just gonna stop and start again. So as you can see, I just download the latest runner jar from 0.9.1 snapshot. So you can get that from our Nexus from JBoss. So if I just run that one, I have the data index, I have messaging, and I have the travel agency running locally. So as you can see, it started fairly quick, and it's running on port 82A as I define here on this port. So let me get to the management console here, just refresh and make sure that's all here. So as I mentioned earlier, so this is the landing page of the management console. We can see by default that we're listing the processes that are active here. So just as a comparison, let's go to the actual application itself, so the travel agency. So we have two active processes at this stage, right? The other one is the Kogito visas. That's running here. It doesn't have any active process. So before we go into the actual steps inside the management console, I just want to show, so this is the Swagger UI for the travel agency. And in here, I just want to highlight that as soon as we add the management add-on into this runtime, all of these endpoints here get available, right? So these are actually the endpoints that the management console will be triggering on this specific runtime. So that's why it's important for us to make sure that those are added here, right? So let's go and explore a little bit of the management console. So by default here, I can see that there is a travels. I can see the highlighted on the text on the badge here is the business key of this travel. So a business key is defined differently from process to process. In this case here, what we have for the travel agency is that we have a code, which is the reservation code. So let's say that I want to find, I need to help this traveler here checking, I want to check his process, right, in the management console. I can come in here, business, find by business key, and that gives me the actual process that's related to that, right? So it doesn't have any child process at this stage, but I can go into the details. I can have a look on this process. I can see the overall data, like the business key itself, the name, the endpoint, and the time that was started. Also, another important feature to highlight here is that we can see a full overview about the current state of the variables of this process, right? So this is a plain JSON view of the process variables at this current point in time, which is quite helpful if you are investigating or need to do any actions on the process. Apart from that, I can come in here and check the timeline. So I can see that the process was started 5 hours ago. Then there's a visa check, and then it's visa required was one of the nodes. I can come back here into model and see it's visa required, and now it's waiting for the visa to be applied, right? So that's the current node that's active in the timeline. So what I'm gonna do here as an example of one operation. So let's say this reservation was created, but the customer for some reason had to cancel this booking. So let's say I just want to abort this process, right? So I can just call an abort, and so as I come here, I can see that my 4Z7, so this one is actually now cancelled, right? So the UI already updated. So that's just one example. So if we go back here, we are back to only active processes, and we can see that before we had 2, now we only have 1. So with this process here, what's interesting to see is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, we can see that this actual travel here, we have 2 other processes supporting this process. So if I go into the details of this process, we can actually see that the timeline has a few more items that were executed. We have more details about the trip, and for instance the hotel that was assigned for this trip, and I can also navigate down to the sub-processes. So I can see the hotel booking here. It was completed, so start, book hotel, and hotel booked. It was all completed fine. I'll navigate back to the parent process, and I can check the flight booking here. So with this process in particular, we can see that the process is actually in an error state, right? So that's shown here, and I can see that the actual node in the process that's failing is this book flight here, and it's marked as an error, and I can see that the message there says that it failed to connect to the flight book system, connection timeout. So what I can do with this node, I can just, let's say that for instance that for this particular reservation, for some reason we changed the reservation, and now it's not needed to book a flight. So I can pretty much actually come in here and just skip that, right? So if I skip that, I can go back to my details. As soon as we refresh the page, I can see the details of the booking. And you can see that the flight booking is actually completed, right? So the travel itself is still active, and what we can see here is that it doesn't have a flight associated to this reservation. So B9, so that's the B9 here. We can see that's completed, but what's asking now is just to confirm the travel, right? So yes, there's no flight, the hotel looks fine, and then I can just complete my booking. So that's one of the features that we can see. So if I just refresh here, so it's gone, right? So let me just see here, what else do I have on this UI? So we can see a few other examples of processes that were completed, the other ones that were aborted. So the B9 one is here, and it was updated a few seconds ago, so it looks completely fine, right? So, but that just do another example here. So you create a new travel to let's say Brisbane, and try to book my trip. So as soon as I get back to my UI here, I can reset to the default. I can see that there is a new travel reservation. One nice thing to highlight here is that we know the actual endpoint of the process. So if you just click on the endpoint, it should redirect you to the actual UI that triggered that process. So remember that I mentioned earlier about the public URL of the process. So that's how it's one of the ways that's used, right? So I can see here my travel has no child process yet. So what I have to do here, I have to apply for the visa. So let's put some over here, and 150 days. If we just refresh, I can see it's still no child process, but I can see that there is another process that came up here, which is the visa application. So this one is actually another service that's running. So remember earlier that I mentioned that we have these two microservices. So this one specifically deals with the applications for visas. So I received that application here. I can come there and just approve that request, right? So as I refresh, so that process itself got completed. So moved out from the active list. So, but again, I can see here that my travel, it's in an error state. Again, it failed to connect to the flight book system, right? So, and I have the operations right here at hand about what I wanted to do. So let's say if that's really was the issue that happened, that the system was timing out, was overloaded, I just really faked that. So I can now, let's say, go and fix that service. I just post it here, and that resolved the problem. That I can come in here and say retry. So I can retry the operation. It successfully re-executed the process, and as soon as I refresh here, I can see that the state is now completed for the flight booking. So again, I can see here, we actually see that the book flight one was marked as active, and then it was retried, was re-executed, right? So that's why we see here, but the process is now completed. So if we look back here, and then if we look back into our reservations, we can see that the flight was correctly assigned to that travel, right? So if I come here again, I just need to confirm my travel, and then refreshing here will return no items for my active travel. So they are all completed. So, and then the things that I mentioned in terms of be able to do these book operations, you can go and use it here. So you can select just the parent process or all the processes that are shown in the UI. So at the current state, you can use the abort operations, but we will be adding more actions to, or more operations in the near future, in the next few releases. So the last thing I want to show is the Domain Explorer. So we saw that regarding these two microservices that we are dealing with for this example, we are actually targeting either travels or visa applications, right? So if I go into the visa applications, what I see here is a list of all the visa applications that were received. So all of the domains, or all the visa applications that were received, they are listed here in the form of a list, where I can actually go and select what sort of information I want to see. So let's say that I want to have a look between the nationality of the person that's applying and the country that this person it's going, versus if the application is actually approved or not. So I could have some cases where, for instance, for some particular nationality, the visa was not approved automatically or something like that. So I can actually come in here and see if there is some way that I can look back into the process to automate. So let's say I can see here a few cases where, say, Australia and Brazilian, they were approved, but might be legislation in place or something like that. So it depends really on the process if it can be automated or not. But so that's one example of what I can see. But let's say, let me just refresh this one. Let's say if there is a visa application that was not approved. So let's go in there and create a new trip. Say Brazilian. So gonna be Germany, street, and I wanna go to Sydney, to that point, so I can book that trip, right? So in this one, I was actually quite fast here, but it actually doesn't need a visa in this situation. So I can just confirm the travel here, and if I look back there, I won't see any visa applications added to the system. So let's create a new one. So Brisbane as Brazilian Zoo, Brisbane. So yeah, so that one I can just see the application. Durations 170 days. Submit the application, right? So as soon as I come here into the Domain Explorer, I see that there is a new visa application that's not approved yet, right? So so let's say that you want to help understand what's going on, why some visa applications are stopping, or why they're taking so long. So you can actually come in here and see, or filter by the approved ones, and actually check from the country that the person that's applying from, the nationality, and where they're trying to go to. So with that, I can actually expand that view and see the actual process that relates to that visa application. So I can see, in the same way that I was showing before, the process details about this specific visa application. I can see the details, the name, the country, and all of that, and I can see that the actual process is waiting on a manual visa approval, right? So if I just come back here, I'll see basically the back to the default columns that are shown for this domain. So if we expand here, so we can see that we have an option for showing all of the attributes exposed by this particular domain. So we can actually go, so if I come back to the one level up to the domain list, I can actually come here and have a look on the domain data regarding the travels, right? So the travels, it's a different domain, a different microservice. So in here by default is showing the data about flights, but let's say I want to change that to, let's say, not the hotel address, but just looking at information regarding hotels, right? In here, what I can actually see is that because our system is very random, you can see that every single travel request has been assigned to the same perfect hotel. But we can see that, for instance, this one here doesn't have any, this particular request for travel. I can see, I'm particularly interested into this one because it doesn't have any details about a hotel, right? So I can actually see here, see the process that relates to that, and I can actually see that the state of that process was aborted. So there's another one here. So this one is active. So I can see that this one, it hasn't been assigned to a hotel yet. So as you can see here, applied for the visa. So it's waiting for the visa decision. That's completely fine. So as you can see, so that's a bit of a overview about the Management Console. I hope you enjoy. Please give us your feedback, and we'll be adding more and more new exciting features in the next few releases. Thank you very much.